Dr. James Smith here at Royal Holloway's English department, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about literature and work. Work over the past few decades has kind of been transformed. Gone is the old model where most of us can expect to have a particular job that would define us through our whole life and career. Instead, we live in a time where we're increasingly expected to have several different jobs, maybe even several different jobs simultaneously. In the past, well, really from the 1970s onwards, many people have praised this as an idea, saying that old forms of work, the jobs that it produced, were very often not very pleasant to do. And we've often been promised a future where a kind of knowledge economy will allow us all to work very differently and work in a more variable, changing way, but nonetheless get more job satisfaction. This may be true for some people, but the reality is that today we live in a situation where we live with the existence of in-work poverty, the fact that having a job, working full-time, is no longer a guarantee of a certain level of quality of life. We also live with the threat of an exponential development of automation. We live facing a future where most of the labour that we perform is going to be surplus to requirements pretty soon. And we're teaching students who are studying with the knowledge that whatever work they do after their studies, they are likely statistically to be considerably worse off than their parents. So work is, as it were, this kind of horizon, or this thing in the peripheral vision of everything we do as educators. Now, historically, literature and work have often been opposed to each other. In a wonderful book of the 1930s, William Empson's Some Versions of Pastoral, he makes the point that however often in its history literature has wanted to represent ordinary work taking place, going right back to the pastoral poetry of the ancient Roman poets, no matter how often in its history literature has wanted to represent work, in a sense literature is always necessarily separate from it. Why is that the case? Well, Empson says poets, authors, writers, insofar as they are writing poetry, insofar as they're performing their task as writers, they're separating themselves from the ordinary run of things. They're separating themselves from ordinary forms of work and are kind of setting themselves up as doing something different. Now, that traditional idea of opposing literature to work comes under some strain in the analysis of a certain tradition in French philosophy in the 20th century. Writers like Maurice Blanchot, Michel Foucault and Jean-Luc Nancy, these people have argued that actually it's rather more difficult to separate what you do from work than this model would imply. In fact, they would say under capitalist society, work and its logic has a way of integrating itself to things that we do in ways that are perhaps unexpected. These writers use the term désœuvrement, the absence of work, the failure of work, the removal of work. They use that term almost as something that literary artists should be aspiring to. For them, it's not simply the case that if you're writing poetry, if you're doing creative writing, you've kind of escaped the logic of work. On the contrary, it becomes this great, almost philosophical effort to think of art outside the concept of work. After all, in both French and English, the word work, œuvre, can apply both to the kinds of ordinary labour, the hard work that people are doing in call centres, supermarkets, banks, whatever, every day. That word also applies to the great works of a literary artist. So even in the word, there's a kind of weird connecting force going on. Now, for Blanchot, Foucault, Nancy, each in their own ways, it should be an aspiration of literary artists to try to kind of avoid this situation in which what they write just gets turned into this great work, only there to be admired, not to actually challenge anything, not to actually change anyone's mind or disturb anything. I'm talking about Herman Melville's great work, Bartleby the Scrivener. Well, this is a story told from the point of view of an employer, of a lawyer who is in charge of several copyists, several people who whose job it is to copy out legal documents. In the story, the narrator finds that one of the guys that he has employed, Bartleby, while initially somebody who works ferociously and effectively in copying documents, suddenly stops wanting to work altogether, and he only replies whenever he's asked to do anything with this very famous phrase, "I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to." And faced with this refusal to work, faced with, as it were, this act of désœuvrement, this abandoning of work, this polite, genteel refusal, "I would prefer not to," the boss just doesn't know what to do. And in fact, this kind of language of preferring infects everybody else in the workplace. There are three other scribes, each of them very interesting in their own right, and it could easily be a task given to students to talk about the attitude that each of them seems to take to their work. It's not only Bartleby, who has a slightly odd one. Anyway, everybody starts talking about preferring. Everybody gets this guy absolutely kind of stuck in their heads, and no one knows what to do about him. At one point, the employer says this: "For the first time in my life, a feeling of overpowering, stinging melancholy seized me. Before, I had never experienced aught but a not unpleasing sadness. The bond of common humanity now drew me irresistibly to gloom, a fraternal melancholy." Well, those words require a bit of interpretation, but the short point is that meeting this guy who simply refuses to work has this kind of transformational effect on the employer. Now, as it goes on, we learn why, or get a suggestion, a speculation as to why Bartleby refuses to work. In the end, the employer can't get rid of him and simply moves office, shuts up shop, and leaves the guy there. He refuses to leave. It turns out that he's actually living in the offices, so the employer, unable to get rid of him, just leaves, and he gets these messages from the people who take over the offices saying, "How can we get rid of this guy?" He ends up starving to death in prison, as it happens. Well, finally, the employer discovers that Bartleby's old job was working in the dead letters office of the post office. That is to say, he was responsible for opening and dealing with the letters that have been sent to people who have died. So a cheque for money sent to somebody to relieve them from poverty too late. A wedding ring sent to somebody, but the proposal has come too late and the person has died. That is what has sent Bartleby to pursue this job as a copyist, simply copying out these legal documents. It is also what has put him in a position where he can no longer work, or rather he would prefer not to. He would also prefer not to eat. He would also prefer not to do anything at all, but eventually die. Very strange story, very kind of peculiar document. It's been commented on in a wonderful recent book. It's a quite heartbreaking book as well, by Ivor Southwood, called Nonstop Inertia, which is a kind of analysis of Southwood's own experiences as an agency worker, working on 0 hours contracts for supermarkets, offices, and other kinds of job. And he talks about Bartleby in one of the chapters, and this is what he has to say, and I'll just close by reading out this passage. "It is unsurprising that Bartleby is much admired by revolutionary philosophers and resentful workers." The guy who, faced with this unpleasant, boring kind of work, simply says, "I would prefer not to," simply removes himself from the world of bad, unsatisfying work. For most present-day employees, however, such outright refusal is not possible, not just for practical reasons, which are clearly of no interest to Bartleby himself, but because of the slippery, ungraspable dimensions of the 21st century workplace. Which is to say, if Bartleby had been an agency worker, the fiction would have turned out rather differently. If one fancifully imagines a temporary data enterer today who preferred not to perform the tasks assigned to him, this would present today's office manager with no such terrible insight, as the employer narrator finds in Melville's story. The boss, again following the path of least resistance, would simply shrug and acknowledge this as the worker's choice, without even questioning his reasons, and order a new temp from the agency to take his place. This new Bartleby could conceivably even keep returning to the non-workplace throughout various reorganisations and changes of ownership, to be gently ridiculed by successive employers like a piece of novelty furniture. He would still perish, of course, in some indeterminate non-place, but no one would witness his final act of rebellion, other than perhaps another temporary worker, say a cleaner or security guard. There would be no one to turn away from, except himself and his own kind.